My son-in-law just called me an ignorant peasant in French at his gallery opening. I'm Raymond Cooper, and Griffin thought I couldn't understand when he told his art world friends that my gift was worthless garbage from a tone-deaf old man. But the sheet music in my hands wasn't garbage. It was an unpublished Debussy manuscript worth $890,000. And Griffin had no idea that his mockery had just triggered something he wasn't prepared for. See, Griffin assumed three things about me tonight. First, that I don't speak French. Second, that I know nothing about classical music. And third, that I'm just some blue-collar nobody who stumbled into his sophisticated world. He was wrong about all three. Devastatingly wrong. What happened next didn't just expose his arrogance. It shattered everything he thought he knew about his family's most painful tragedy. If you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this is about to get intense. Let me back up to explain how I ended up in this situation. 3 years ago, when Griffin married my daughter Sarah, I made a decision that probably saved our family. I decided to hide who I really was. See, Griffin had just lost his younger sister Sophie in a car accident. She was 19, a music student at Manhattan School of Music, and her death had destroyed him. He couldn't listen to classical music anymore. Couldn't be around anything that reminded him of her talent, her dreams, her future that would never happen. So when Sarah brought home this broken young man who was trying to rebuild his life in the art world, as far away from music as possible, I made a choice. I didn't tell him I was Professor Raymond Cooper, recently retired from Juilliard after 35 years. I didn't mention my specialty in French Impressionist composers. I didn't talk about my consulting work with auction houses or my collection of rare manuscripts. Instead, I became Ray the piano tuner. Which wasn't technically a lie. I did tune pianos as a hobby, staying connected to the instruments I'd spent my life studying. But it wasn't the whole truth either. Griffin needed a father-in-law who wouldn't remind him of his sister's world. So that's what I gave him. For 3 years, I've watched him slowly heal, build his gallery business, find confidence in contemporary art, create a new identity that didn't include the crushing weight of musical genius lost too soon. But I've also watched him become someone else. Someone harder, more dismissive of people he considers beneath his cultural level. Tonight's gallery opening at Meridian Contemporary in Soho was supposed to be different. Sarah had begged me to come, said Griffin was finally ready to bridge the gap between us. She'd even suggested I bring him something meaningful, a peace offering to show I understood his world. That's when I remembered the manuscript. I'd acquired it 5 years ago through an estate sale in Connecticut. The elderly owner, Mrs. Chen, was selling her late husband's collection of classical memorabilia. Most of it was standard stuff, signed programs, vintage recordings, reproduction scores, but buried in a box of miscellaneous papers was something extraordinary. An unpublished Debussy composition, Daydream for Sophie, dated 1894. The authentication process took 2 years and cost me $12,000. Bibliothèque Nationale de France confirmed the paper and ink. Sotheby's provided the $890,000 valuation. The Debussy Foundation verified the composer's handwriting against known exemplars. I'd planned to donate it to a museum, but when Sarah asked me to bring Griffin something special, something that might help us connect, I thought maybe this was the moment. Maybe it was time to start bridging the gap between Ray the piano tuner and Professor Cooper. I should have known better. The Meridian Contemporary Gallery was packed with Manhattan's art elite. Polished concrete floors reflected track lighting that cost more than most people's cars. I stood near the back in my simple navy cardigan and worn leather shoes, watching sophisticated people discuss market values and investment opportunities. Griffin approached with his usual professional confidence, tailored charcoal suit perfectly fitted, surrounded by potential clients. Behind him were 2 serious collectors I recognized from Art News magazine, people whose opinions could make or break careers in the contemporary art world. Ray! Griffin's greeting was warm enough, but I could see the slight tension around his eyes. Having his blue-collar father-in-law at his professional event wasn't ideal. Sarah said you had something for me? I handed him the protective sleeve containing the manuscript. Through the clear plastic, aged cream paper showed handwritten musical notation in brown ink. Griffin accepted it with the polite enthusiasm of someone receiving an obligation gift. Sheet music. That's thoughtful. And that's when everything went wrong. Griffin held the manuscript up to examine it, and I could see his expression shift from polite interest to barely concealed amusement. The small crowd around us, Gallery assistants, art bloggers, potential buyers sensed something happening and moved closer. "Interesting," Griffin said, his voice carrying just enough volume to include his audience. "Where did you find this, Ray?" "Estate sale in Connecticut," I replied honestly. Griffin nodded knowingly, sharing a look with his companions. "Ah, estate sales. You have to be careful with those. Lots of reproductions floating around." The way he said reproductions made it clear what he thought of my purchase. One of the collectors, a woman in an expensive black dress, leaned closer. "What kind of music is it?" "Appears to be classical," Griffin said, tilting the manuscript toward her. "Probably printed from a website. You can get anything online these days." If I stayed silent now, several things would happen, and none of them good. First, my relationship with Griffin would calcify permanently. He'd always see me as the well-meaning but naive father-in-law who embarrassed him at professional events. Our family dinners would become even more strained, filled with his patient condescension. Second, Sarah would blame herself. She'd orchestrated this evening specifically to bring Griffin and me together. She'd spent weeks convincing me to attend, promising it would be a chance for us to find common ground. Watching her gift-giving moment turn into a source of shame would crush her. Third, Griffin would never understand what he'd actually received, never grasp the significance of the music in his hands or how it connected to the sister he'd lost. But the worst part was watching the crowd's reaction. These weren't cruel people. They were just following Griffin's lead, taking their cues from someone they respected in the art world. If Griffin had treated my gift with curiosity instead of dismissal, they would have been intrigued. Instead, they were learning it was safe to look down on the old man with the fake manuscript. "The paper quality looks modern," said a young gallery assistant, trying to impress Griffin with her observational skills. Griffin nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Real period manuscripts have specific aging characteristics. This is clearly contemporary paper, probably laser printed." The circle of onlookers had grown to include a dozen people now. Art collectors, cultural journalists, gallery staff, all watching Griffin demonstrate his expertise at my expense. Plus, Griffin continued, warming to his subject, authentic manuscripts come with documentation. Provenance papers, authentication certificates, institutional verification. They don't just show up in plastic sleeves from Office Max. More knowing chuckles from the crowd. "Griffin," Sarah said quietly, appearing at my elbow. "Maybe we should—" "No, it's fine," Griffin interrupted, his professional persona fully engaged. "This is actually educational. People need to understand how to spot reproductions in the marketplace." He gestured toward the manuscript like a professor with a teaching prop. "See, real musical manuscripts, especially valuable ones, are incredibly rare. The chances of finding an authentic piece by a major composer at a random estate sale are essentially zero." The crowd murmured agreement. Griffin's logic was sound, his expertise unquestioned. "And let's be honest," Griffin continued, "even if this were somehow authentic, what would a piano tuner be doing with a manuscript worth hundreds of thousands of dollars?" That got the biggest laugh yet. The absurdity of the blue-collar guy owning museum-quality art struck everyone as genuinely funny. But then Griffin made his critical mistake. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the adrenaline of performing for his peers. Maybe it was just years of accumulated frustration with having a father-in-law who didn't fit his carefully curated world. Whatever the reason, Griffin switched to French. "My friends," he said to his companions, "that's exactly the problem with people like my father-in-law. They don't understand the difference between real art and cheap reproductions. My friends, this is exactly the problem with people like my father-in-law. They don't understand the difference between real art and cheap reproductions." The words hit me like a slap, not because of the insult. I'd been called worse things by better people, but because of the casual cruelty, the assumption that I couldn't understand, the performance of superiority for an audience. "Dad doesn't know anything about culture," Griffin continued, building confidence from his friend's appreciative smiles. "He thinks a piece of paper with scribbled notes on it is valuable because he bought it at a garage sale. Papa knows nothing about culture. He thinks a piece of paper with scribbled notes has value because he bought it at a garage sale." Sarah was looking confused. She didn't speak French, but I understood every syllable. The question was, how long was I going to let this continue? Griffin was just getting started. The French had loosened his tongue, made him feel safe in his superiority. His audience was appreciating the performance, even if they couldn't understand the words. "And look how he's standing there," Griffin continued in French, gesturing toward me with theatrical pity. "He probably thinks he's made a major discovery, a hidden treasure. And look how he stands there. He probably thinks he's made a major discovery, a hidden treasure." The crowd's laughter was getting more confident. They were feeding off Griffin's energy, enjoying the cultural superiority he was demonstrating. But then something unexpected happened. A man I hadn't noticed before stepped closer to examine the manuscript. He was well-dressed, probably in his 50s, with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine expertise rather than social posturing. "Excuse me," he said to Griffin, "but could I take a closer look at that?" Griffin paused his French commentary. "Of course, though I should warn you, it's almost certainly a reproduction." The man, I'd later learn he was Dr. Marcus Webb, a concert pianist, studied the manuscript through its protective sleeve with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen thousands of musical scores. "The notation style is interesting," he said carefully, "very characteristic of late 19th century French composers." Griffin's confidence wavered slightly. "Well, yes, whoever created the reproduction did their research, but the paper quality gives it away immediately." Dr. Webb looked up at Griffin with a slight frown. "Actually, the paper looks quite authentic to me. That's definitely period stock. You can tell by the texture and the way the ink has settled into the fibers." The crowd's energy shifted. Griffin's narrative was being challenged by someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Griffin asked, his dealer instincts kicking in. "Marcus Webb. I perform at Carnegie Hall regularly, and I've handled quite a few historical manuscripts in my time." Griffin's face flushed slightly. He was losing control of his audience, and he knew it. "Dr. Webb," Griffin said, forcing a diplomatic smile, "I appreciate your input, but I deal with authentication issues professionally. This manuscript simply doesn't have the proper documentation to be considered authentic." "What kind of documentation would you expect?" Dr. Webb asked. Griffin seized the opportunity to regain his authority. "Provenance papers from the source institution, authentication certificates from organizations like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, valuation assessments from recognized auction houses like Sotheby's or Christie's." He turned back to me, switching to English but keeping the condescending tone. "Ray, you mentioned this came from an estate sale. Did the seller provide any paperwork, any documentation at all?" This was my moment. I could have produced the authentication folder I'd brought with me, 3 years of paperwork proving every word Griffin had just said was necessary, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of watching Griffin slowly heal from his sister's death, seeing him build a new identity around visual art because music was too painful. Maybe it was my own guilt about the deception I'd maintained for 3 years. Or maybe it was just curiosity. How far would Griffin take this performance? How cruel would he get when he thought he was safe? "I have some paperwork at home," I said simply. Griffin's smile became genuinely pitying. "Ray, I'm sure you have some kind of certificate of authenticity, but you have to understand, those are easy to fake. Real authentication requires institutional verification." He turned back to Dr. Webb, professional to professional. "The problem with estate sales is that people find items they don't understand and create stories around them. They want to believe they've discovered something valuable, so they invest in fake documentation to support that belief." Dr. Webb was studying my face now, not the manuscript. Something about my expression seemed to intrigue him. "What's the composer listed on this piece?" Dr. Webb asked. Griffin glanced at the manuscript. "Claude Debussy, Reverie pour Sophie, dated 1894. Dr. Webb's eyebrows shot up. "Daydream for Sophie? I've never heard of that composition." "Exactly," Griffin said triumphantly, "because it doesn't exist. Debussy never wrote a piece with that title." But Dr. Webb was shaking his head. "Actually, that's not necessarily true. Debussy wrote dozens of small pieces that were never published. Many were gifts for students or friends, and they've been lost to history." Griffin's confidence was cracking now. His simple narrative of fraud and deception was becoming complicated by actual expertise. "Dr. Webb," Griffin said carefully, "surely you're not suggesting that this could be an authentic Debussy manuscript?" "I'm suggesting," Dr. Webb replied, "that dismissing it without proper examination would be premature." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing tension between the two men. Griffin's art world authority was being challenged by musical expertise, and the outcome wasn't certain. That's when Elena Vasquez, the gallery owner, approached our group. She'd been watching the exchange from across the room, and her expression suggested concern. "Griffin," she said quietly, "perhaps we should continue this conversation privately." But Griffin was too deep in now. His reputation was on the line in front of potential clients, and he couldn't afford to back down. "Elena, it's fine," he said. "I think it's important that people understand how to evaluate authenticity claims." He held up the manuscript again, his voice carrying across the gallery. "This is a perfect example of wishful thinking becoming expensive delusion. My father-in-law has convinced himself he owns a valuable Debussy manuscript, probably based on some forged documentation he bought along with it." Griffin looked directly at me. "Ray, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but you need to accept reality here. This is a reproduction, probably worth about $20 at most." $20. For a manuscript I'd spent 3 years and $12,000 authenticating. For a piece of music that had changed my understanding of Debussy's late period. For a composition that, unknown to everyone in this room, had a connection to Griffin's family that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his sister's death. I looked around the gallery at the faces watching me, some sympathetic, some amused, all waiting to see how the old man would handle being exposed as a fool, and I made my decision. "Griffin," I said quietly, "before you continue, I have a question." Something in my tone made the crowd pause. Maybe it was the stillness in my voice, or the way I'd stopped looking embarrassed and started looking focused. "What's your question, Ray?" Griffin asked, still confident but sensing a shift in the room's energy. "You mentioned that real manuscripts come with documentation from institutions like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. That's correct." "And valuation assessments from auction houses like Sotheby's." "Yes." "And that Debussy never wrote a piece called Daydream for Sophie." Griffin nodded. "Right. It's not in any catalog of his works." Dr. Webb was watching me intently now. Elena Vasquez had moved closer, her face troubled. "Interesting," I said, "because you seem to know quite a bit about musical authentication for someone who works exclusively in contemporary visual art." Griffin's smile faltered slightly. "I make it my business to understand all areas of the art market, including 19th century French composers. I have a broad cultural education." "From where?" The question seemed to surprise Griffin. "From where what?" "Where did you study French musical history? Which professors? Which texts?" Griffin's confidence was wavering now. "I'm largely self-taught in that area." "Ah," I nodded thoughtfully. "So when you say Debussy never wrote Reverie pour Sophie, you're basing that on the standard catalogues of his works." "Which catalogues specifically?" Griffin was beginning to look uncomfortable. The standard ones, the comprehensive lists." Dr. Webb stepped forward. "Actually, there is no single comprehensive catalogue of Debussy's unpublished works. The Debussy Foundation has been working on that project for decades, but it's far from complete." Griffin shot Dr. Webb an irritated look. "Fine, but the point remains. This manuscript doesn't have proper documentation." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Proper documentation is essential." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folder I'd been carrying all evening. "Which is why I brought this." Griffin's face went pale as I opened the folder to reveal a stack of official documents. Even from a distance, the letterheads were clearly visible. Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Sotheby's Manuscripts Department. The Debussy Foundation. "What is that?" Griffin asked weakly. "The documentation you said was necessary," I replied. "Authentication certificate from the Bibliothèque Nationale, reference number BNF 2024-0847, Sotheby's valuation assessment, dated March 2024, and verification from the Debussy Foundation confirming the manuscript's authenticity." The gallery had gone dead silent. Everyone was staring at the folder in my hands. Dr. Webb was the first to speak. "May I see those?" I handed him the documents. He studied them carefully, his expression growing more amazed with each page. "These are real," he said softly. "This is legitimate institutional authentication." Griffin was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. How did you—" "The question, Griffin, is not how I obtained proper authentication," I said. "The question is why you were so certain I couldn't have." Elena Vasquez was reading over Dr. Webb's shoulder. "Professor Cooper," she said suddenly, her voice filled with recognition. Everyone turned to look at her. "You're Professor Raymond Cooper," she continued, "from Juilliard. I took your Music and Society seminar at Columbia when you were a guest lecturer." The gallery crowd stirred. The name meant something to them, even if they couldn't place it immediately. "Professor?" Griffin's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Webb looked up from the documents with new understanding. "Raymond Cooper, of course. You're the leading expert on French Impressionist composers in America." "Retired," I said simply. Griffin was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "You're a professor? At Juilliard?" "Was, for 35 years. But you tune pianos. I've seen your van." "I tune pianos because I enjoy staying connected to the instruments. It's a hobby, not a profession." The crowd was murmuring now, reassessing everything they'd witnessed. The narrative had flipped completely. Griffin's expert dismissal of my gift had just been exposed as uninformed arrogance. But there was something else in Griffin's eyes now. Something beyond embarrassment or shock. Recognition. Because if I was Professor Raymond Cooper, expert on French Impressionist composers, then I would have known about his sister Sophie. I would have known about her talent, her training, her tragic death. And suddenly the manuscript in his hands felt very different. Griffin was struggling to process what he'd learned, but his survival instincts were kicking in. He couldn't afford to collapse in front of his professional peers, no matter how wrong he'd been. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice gaining strength. "If you're really a Juilliard professor, why didn't you ever tell me? Why let me think you were just a piano tuner?" It was a good question, and it temporarily shifted the focus away from his own mistakes. "You never asked about my background," I replied. "But Sarah must have known. She would have told me." I looked at my daughter, who was staring at me with her mouth open. "Sarah, did you know I was a professor?" "No," she whispered. "You always just said you worked with pianos." Griffin seized on this. "So you've been lying to your own daughter for years? Hiding your real identity?" The accusation hung in the air. Griffin was trying to reframe the situation, make me the deceptive one instead of confronting his own humiliation. "I never lied," I said calmly. "I work with pianos. I just didn't specify in what capacity." "That's semantics," Griffin shot back. "Why would you hide being a professor? Why pretend to be something you're not?" The crowd was with him again. His logic felt sound. Why would anyone conceal such prestigious credentials? "Griffin," Elena said quietly, "maybe this isn't the place." "No," Griffin interrupted, his confidence returning. "I think we deserve an explanation. This whole situation is bizarre. A retired professor pretending to be a working-class piano tuner, showing up at my gallery with $1 million manuscript he's apparently been hiding?" He turned to address the crowd directly. "Don't you think this is strange? Why would someone conceal their expertise and then dramatically reveal it like this?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gallery. Griffin was successfully redirecting their focus from his own mistakes to my supposed deception. "And another thing," Griffin continued, warming to his theme. "If Professor Cooper really is an expert on French composers, why didn't he correct me earlier? Why let me embarrass myself before revealing his credentials?" Dr. Webb looked troubled. "That is an interesting question." Griffin nodded eagerly. "Exactly. It's like he was setting me up, waiting for me to make mistakes so he could humiliate me publicly." The crowd was nodding now. Griffin's narrative was compelling, the vengeful professor engineering his son-in-law's public embarrassment. "Which raises another question," Griffin said, his voice growing stronger. "Why this manuscript? Why this specific piece? Professor Cooper could have brought any number of authentic compositions to demonstrate his expertise. Why choose something so dramatically expensive? Why choose something designed to make my dismissal look as foolish as possible?" Sarah was looking back and forth between us, confusion and hurt evident on her face. "Griffin," she said quietly, "you're being paranoid." "Am I?" Griffin turned to her. "Sarah, think about it. Your father has been lying to us for 3 years about who he really is. Tonight he shows up at my gallery with nearly $1 million worth of sheet music, lets me publicly mock it, then dramatically reveals his true identity to maximum humiliating effect." He gestured to the crowd. "If that's not a setup, what is it?" The logic was working. People were nodding, seeing the pattern Griffin was describing. "And you know what the worst part is?" Griffin's voice was rising now. "This whole performance is about music, classical music, the one subject he knows I can't bear to discuss." The crowd stirred uncomfortably. This was getting personal. "My sister died 3 years ago," Griffin announced to the room. "Sophie was a music student, incredibly talented, and her death destroyed our family. Professor Cooper knows this. Sarah must have told him. So what does he do? He brings me a piece of classical music, waits for me to reject it, then uses my rejection to humiliate me." Griffin's eyes were bright with tears now, but his voice remained strong. "That's not just deceptive, it's cruel, using my grief against me to engineer some kind of twisted revenge." The gallery was completely silent. Griffin had reframed the entire evening, cast himself as the grieving brother being manipulated by a calculating professor who'd used insider knowledge of family tragedy to orchestrate public humiliation. Elena looked stricken. Dr. Webb was shaking his head sadly. Even Sarah seemed uncertain now. "Griffin," I said quietly, "that's not what—" "Isn't it?" Griffin interrupted. "Then explain it to me, Professor. Explain why you hid your identity for 3 years. Explain why you chose tonight to reveal it. Explain why you picked classical music, the one thing guaranteed to trigger my grief, as your weapon of choice." Griffin held up the manuscript like evidence in a trial. "This isn't a gift, Professor Cooper. This is psychological warfare, and everyone in this room just watched you execute it." The crowd was completely with Griffin now. His pain was real, his logic compelling. I'd been cast as the villain, the cruel academic who'd used a family's tragedy to engineer professional revenge. "You want to know what I think really happened?" Griffin continued, his voice carrying across the gallery. "I think you've resented me for years, resented that I moved Sarah into the contemporary art world instead of your precious classical music scene. Resented that I couldn't appreciate your area of expertise because it reminded me too much of my dead sister." Griffin was building to a crescendo now, his professional persona fully engaged. "So you waited, you planned, you found the most expensive, most impressive piece of musical history you could acquire, then you set me up to reject it so you could humiliate me in front of my peers and clients." He turned to me directly. "The only question is, how long have you been planning this?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Griffin had successfully turned the tables, made himself the victim and me the manipulator, and the worst part was, some of what he'd said was true. The gallery was completely silent, waiting for my response to Griffin's accusations. Every face was turned toward me, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all expecting an explanation. I looked at my son-in-law, this young man I'd watched struggle with grief for 3 years, now standing before his peers with tears in his eyes, convinced I'd engineered his humiliation. "Griffin," I said quietly, "you're right about several things." The admission surprised everyone, including Griffin himself. "I did hide my identity from you. I did choose to reveal it tonight, and I did know that classical music would be difficult for you." Griffin's expression grew triumphant, vindicated. "But," I continued, "you're wrong about why?" "Then explain it," Griffin demanded. I looked around the gallery, at the faces of Manhattan's art elite watching this family drama unfold. These weren't the circumstances I'd imagined for this conversation, but perhaps they were the right ones. "I hid my identity," I said, "because you needed me to." Griffin's confidence faltered. "What?" 3 years ago when you married Sarah, you were broken. Sophie's death had shattered your relationship with music, and you were building a new life around visual art. The last thing you needed was a father-in-law who would constantly remind you of the world you'd lost. I paused, letting that sink in. So I became Ray the piano tuner, someone safe, someone who wouldn't trigger your grief or make you feel like you had to pretend to appreciate classical music for family harmony. Dr. Webb was listening intently. Elena had tears in her eyes. "For 3 years," I continued, "I watched you heal, watched you build confidence in the art world, watched you create a new identity that didn't include the weight of musical genius lost too soon." Griffin's face was changing, his anger being replaced by confusion. "But I also watched you become someone else," I said. "Someone harder, more dismissive, more willing to look down on people you considered culturally inferior." "I never—" Griffin started. "Tonight," I interrupted gently, "you spent 20 minutes publicly mocking a gift from your father-in-law because you assumed he was too ignorant to understand your cruelty." The words hit Griffin like a physical blow. "You performed your superiority for an audience," I continued, "using someone you thought couldn't defend himself as entertainment for your peers." Griffin opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. "That's not the man who married my daughter," I said. "That's not the man who loved Sophie enough to change his entire career path, rather than face daily reminders of her absence." Griffin was crying now, but silently. "Griffin," I said, "grief changes us. Sometimes it makes us harder, more defensive. We protect ourselves by deciding that other people aren't worthy of our consideration." Dr. Webb stepped forward. "If I may, Professor Cooper, how did you know about Sophie?" "Because I was there," I said simply. Griffin's head snapped up. "Where?" "Carnegie Hall. May 15th, 2016. The Rising Stars Showcase. Griffin went completely white. That was Sophie's last performance. I know. But why were you there? You didn't know our family then. Sarah had mentioned her boyfriend's sister was performing at Carnegie Hall. She was so excited about it, kept talking about how talented Sophie was, how proud you were of her. Griffin's voice was barely audible. You came to hear Sophie play? I wanted to understand what kind of music mattered to the young man my daughter was falling in love with. The gallery crowd was completely absorbed now, understanding they were witnessing something far more complex than professional humiliation. She was extraordinary, I continued. Chopin's Ballad No. 1, Schumann's Carnival, and then, as her final piece. Don't, Griffin whispered. Daydream for Sophie. Griffin collapsed into a nearby chair, the manuscript still clutched in his hands. Elena was staring at me. Professor Cooper, is this the same manuscript Sophie performed that night? No, I said. But it's the same composition. Dr. Webb's eyes widened. You mean there are multiple copies? I mean, I said carefully, that Sophie's performance that night was so moving that I spent the next 2 years trying to locate the original manuscript. When I finally found it in that estate sale, I had it authenticated specifically because I remembered how beautifully she'd played it. Griffin looked up at me through his tears. You bought this because of Sophie? I bought it to honor her memory. But why give it to me? Why now? I looked around the gallery one more time. Because I thought you were ready to remember Sophie with joy instead of just pain. Griffin's voice cracked. I'm not ready. I know that now. Elena was shaking her head in amazement. Professor Cooper, this manuscript, if it's authentic Debussy worth $890,000, why would you give it away? Because some things are worth more than money, I said simply. Dr. Webb was studying the authentication documents again. These are legitimate. Bibliothèque Nationale, Sotheby's, Debussy Foundation. This is the real thing. He looked up at Griffin. Do you understand what you're holding? Griffin stared down at the manuscript with new eyes. Sophie's music. More than that, Dr. Webb said. You're holding a piece of musical history that your sister brought to life. She may have been one of the only people ever to perform this composition. Griffin's shoulders started shaking. 3 years of suppressed grief were finally breaking through. I couldn't listen to her recordings after she died, he whispered. Couldn't bear to hear her voice. Her music. It hurt too much. I know, I said. But this... Griffin held up the manuscript. This isn't just any music. This is Sophie's music. Yes. And you've been keeping it for 2 years? Waiting for the right moment to give it to me? Waiting for you to be strong enough to receive it. Griffin looked around the gallery at the faces watching him with sympathy and understanding instead of judgment. Professor Cooper, he said finally, I owe you an apology. You owe me nothing. I do. Griffin stood up, wiping his eyes. I've been cruel to you for 3 years, dismissive, condescending, and tonight I humiliated you in front of all these people. Griffin, no, let me finish. Griffin turned to address the crowd. I spent the last hour demonstrating everything wrong with cultural elitism. I assumed my father-in-law was ignorant because he didn't fit my sophisticated image. I mocked his gift without understanding its value. I performed cruelty for your entertainment. The gallery was completely silent. Professor Cooper didn't engineer my humiliation, Griffin continued. I engineered it myself, by choosing superiority over curiosity, by choosing judgment over love. Griffin looked down at the manuscript one more time. This isn't just a Debussy original worth nearly $1 million, he said to the room. It's a lesson in what we lose when we stop seeing the humanity in other people. And that's when the real healing began. Griffin sat back down, still holding the manuscript, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the polite distance of our family dinners, not the professional courtesy of tonight's opening, but something raw and vulnerable. Professor Cooper, he said quietly, can I ask you something that might sound strange? Of course. Do you remember anything else about that night? About Sophie's performance? I nodded. Every detail. She wore a midnight blue dress with small silver buttons. She announced each piece to the audience herself, which was unusual for student recitals. And before she played the Debussy, she said something I'll never forget. Griffin's breath caught. What did she say? She said, this next piece was written for someone named Sophie over a century ago. Tonight I get to bring her voice back to life. Griffin broke down completely. His professional composure shattered, and he sobbed openly in front of the entire gallery. Sarah rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him. "That's exactly what she would say," Griffin whispered through his tears. "Sophie always talked about music like it was alive, like composers were writing letters to the future." I waited for him to collect himself before continuing. There was more he needed to know, and it wouldn't get easier. "Griffin, there's something else about that night." He looked up at me, still crying. I stayed after the performance. I wanted to congratulate Sophie personally, to tell her how moving her interpretation had been. She would have loved that. Sophie lived for feedback from professors. I found her backstage with your parents. She was glowing, absolutely radiant with the joy of what she'd just accomplished. Griffin nodded. That was the last time I saw her truly happy. We talked for about 10 minutes. She told me about her plans, Juilliard applications, summer festivals, her dream of performing at Lincoln Center someday. Sarah was listening intently now, learning about her husband's family history for the first time. She also told me about her brother, I continued, about Griffin, the art dealer who was so proud of her that he'd taken the night off from his gallery opening to hear her play. Griffin's face crumpled. She said that? She said you were the person who believed in her talent when everyone else thought music was an impractical career choice. She said you were her champion. The words hit Griffin like physical blows. He'd forgotten in his grief that he'd once been Sophie's biggest supporter. "Professor Cooper," he said finally, "what happened to her? The official report said car accident, but—" I hesitated. This was the part I'd hoped never to discuss. "Griffin, are you sure you want to know?" "I need to know. I've spent 3 years wondering." I looked around the gallery. The crowd had mostly dispersed, sensing this conversation was becoming too private for public consumption. Only Dr. Webb, Elena, and a few close friends remained. "It wasn't a car accident," I said quietly. Griffin's face went white. "What?" "Sophie called me 3 days after her Carnegie Hall performance. She was struggling." "Struggling how?" "The performance had been so perfect, so transcendent, that she felt like she'd peaked. She was 21 years old and convinced she'd never play that beautifully again." Griffin shook his head. "That's impossible. Sophie was just getting started. That's what I told her. But she was dealing with something I didn't fully understand at the time. The pressure of perfection, the fear that her Carnegie Hall performance was the best she'd ever be." Sarah was crying now too. "Professor Cooper, what are you saying?" "I'm saying Sophie didn't die in a car accident. She took her own life 3 days after the most successful performance of her career." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Griffin stopped breathing. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not. The police said what your parents asked them to say. They couldn't bear for Sophie's death to overshadow her musical legacy." Griffin was shaking his head violently. "You're wrong. Sophie was happy that night. You said so yourself." "She was happy that night, but happiness and hope aren't the same thing. Sophie was battling demons none of us could see." Elena had covered her mouth with her hands. Dr. Webb was staring at the floor. "Did she—" Griffin's voice cracked. "Did she say anything? Before she—" I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She left a letter. Your parents gave me a copy because Sophie had mentioned our conversation in it." Griffin stared at the letter like it might burn him. "What does it say?" "That's for you to decide. But Griffin, you should know. Sophie's death wasn't your fault. There was nothing you could have done." "How can you know that?" "Because she wrote about you, about how proud she was to be your sister, about how grateful she was for your support. Her death wasn't about anything missing from her life. It was about the weight of her own expectations." Griffin took the letter with trembling hands but didn't unfold it. "Professor Cooper," he said, "why didn't my parents tell me the truth?" "Because you were 26 years old, just starting your art career." They'd already lost one child to the pressure of artistic perfectionism. They couldn't bear to lose you to guilt and survivor's remorse. "So they made up the car accident? They told a story that would let you grieve without blame. It was an act of love." Griffin sat in silence for a long moment, holding both the letter and the manuscript. "The Debussy piece," he said finally. "Was it really Sophie's favorite?" "According to her letter, yes. She wrote that playing it felt like having a conversation with Debussy himself, like he'd composed it specifically for her to discover." Dr. Webb stepped forward gently. "Griffin, if I may, I've seen this before. Young performers who achieve transcendent moments and then become paralyzed by the fear they'll never reach those heights again. Sophie wasn't weak, Griffin said fiercely. No one said she was weak. Mental illness isn't weakness, it's illness. Sophie was fighting a battle you couldn't see. Sarah was holding Griffin's hand now. Honey, maybe your parents were trying to protect you. From what? From the truth about my own sister? From guilt that would have destroyed you, I said. They watched Sophie struggle with perfectionism for years. They couldn't bear to watch you blame yourself for not seeing the signs. Griffin looked around the gallery, at the art he'd surrounded himself with, at the life he'd built far from the world of classical music. Is that why you became an art dealer? Elena asked gently. To get away from music? Griffin nodded slowly. After Sophie died, I couldn't hear classical music without thinking about all the performances she'd never give, all the music she'd never play. But this manuscript, I said, this is music she did play, music she brought to life. When you look at these notes, you're not seeing what Sophie lost, you're seeing what she achieved. Griffin unfolded Sophie's letter and read it silently, tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he looked up at me with something approaching peace. She mentions you, he said. She says the professor who stayed to talk with her after the performance reminded her why she loved music in the first place. Sophie reminded me why I loved music, I replied. Watching her play that night was like seeing Debussy's intentions come to life. Griffin stood up, still holding the manuscript. Professor Cooper, I need to ask you something else. Anything. Would you teach me to play this piece? The request surprised everyone, including me. Griffin, you don't play piano. I'm learning. I started lessons last month. It was supposed to be a surprise for Sarah. But now... He held up the manuscript. Now I want to learn this piece specifically. I want to play Sophie's music. Sarah started crying again, but these were tears of joy. Griffin, I said softly, it would be my honor to teach you your sister's favorite piece. And in that moment, 3 years of careful distance between us finally collapsed into the family relationship we should have had all along. The immediate aftermath was quieter than I'd expected. The gallery crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving just our small group to process what had happened. Griffin sat with Sophie's letter in one hand and the manuscript in the other, like a man trying to balance his past and future. Professor Cooper, Elena said softly, I owe you an apology. When Griffin was speaking in French earlier, I should have intervened. You had no way of knowing what was happening. I should have trusted my instincts. Something felt wrong about the whole situation. Dr. Webb was examining the authentication documents one more time. Professor, if you don't mind my asking, how did you finance the acquisition and authentication of this manuscript? The process you described would have cost tens of thousands. It was a fair question, and one I'd expected. I inherited some money from my parents a few years ago, I said, and I'd been collecting rare manuscripts as investments for my retirement. When I found this piece and realized its connection to Sophie's performance, it seemed like the right use of those funds. Griffin looked up from Sophie's letter. Professor Cooper, this manuscript is worth $890,000. You can't just give it away. I'm not giving it away, I replied. I'm entrusting it to Sophie's family. But your retirement... Griffin, I'm 73 years old. I have enough money to live comfortably. What I don't have is enough time to make this manuscript matter to someone who needs it. Sarah was crying again. Dad, you've been planning this for 2 years? Not planning exactly, hoping. Waiting for the right moment. What if tonight had gone differently? She asked. What if Griffin had appreciated the gift without all the drama? Then I would have told him the story quietly, over dinner. But sometimes the most important conversations happen in the least expected ways. Elena was shaking her head in amazement. This is going to become legendary in the art world. The story of the professor who spent 2 years authenticating a manuscript just to give it to his grieving son-in-law. Actually, Dr. Webb interjected, I think this story is going to reach far beyond the art world. The classical music community needs to hear about Sophie's legacy, about the manuscript, about the scholarship Professor Cooper mentioned. Griffin looked confused. What scholarship? I realized I hadn't mentioned that part yet. The Sophie Montgomery Memorial Scholarship at Manhattan School of Music. I established it after her death to help promising young pianists who might be struggling with the pressure she faced. Griffin stared at me. You created a scholarship in Sophie's name? The music world lost something precious when Sophie died. The scholarship is a way to make sure her legacy supports other young artists. How much? Griffin asked quietly. $25,000 annually. It's enough to cover tuition for a talented student who might not otherwise be able to afford conservatory training. Griffin was quiet for a long moment. Professor Cooper, can I contribute to that scholarship? Of course. I want to increase it to $50,000 annually, and I want to expand it to include art students as well as musicians, students who are dealing with the same pressures Sophie faced. Sarah squeezed his hand. Honey, that's beautiful. Sophie would have wanted to support all kinds of artists, Griffin said. She never believed in boundaries between art forms. Elena was wiping her eyes. Griffin, that's a wonderful way to honor her memory. Dr. Webb pulled out his phone. I'm going to make some calls tomorrow. Several concert pianists I know would be interested in performing Reverie Pour Sophie in Sophie's honor. We could organize a memorial concert series. I'd like that, Griffin said, but only if Professor Cooper thinks Sophie would have approved. I smiled. Sophie would have loved knowing her music was bringing people together. As we prepared to leave the gallery, Griffin carefully placed the manuscript back in its protective sleeve. Professor Cooper, he said, I have one more request. What's that? Would you mind if we called you Ray? I know you're Professor Cooper to the rest of the world, but I'd like to think of you as family. I'd like that very much. Griffin extended his hand, then thought better of it and embraced me instead. Thank you, he whispered. For keeping Sophie's memory alive when I couldn't. Thank you for trusting me with her story. As we walked out of the gallery together, Sarah between Griffin and me, her arms linked through ours, I realized that sometimes the most valuable gifts aren't the ones we give, but the ones we receive in return. Griffin had given me something I hadn't even known I was missing. A son who understood that love sometimes works in mysterious ways, and that the most powerful healing often comes through honoring what we've lost, rather than running from it. 6 months later, I was sitting in Griffin and Sarah's living room, watching my son-in-law's fingers move carefully across the piano keys. He was playing the opening measures of Reverie Pour Sophie, his technique still uncertain but his intention clear. Remember, I said gently, Debussy wanted this to feel like a conversation, not a performance. Let the melody breathe. Griffin nodded, adjusting his touch. The music that emerged was simple but heartfelt. Not the transcendent interpretation Sophie had given it, but something equally valuable. A brother's love made audible. Better, I said. Sophie would be proud. Griffin smiled, continuing to play. We'd been having weekly lessons since that night at the gallery, and slowly, carefully, he was rebuilding his relationship with music. Not as the overwhelming force that had defined and ultimately claimed Sophie, but as a language of connection and memory. The manuscript itself was now professionally framed and mounted on the wall above the piano, not as a museum piece, but as a living part of their home. Griffin had insisted on displaying the authentication documents alongside it, not to prove its value, but to honor the journey that had brought it to him. Ray, Griffin said, pausing in his practice, Sarah and I have some news. I looked up from the score I'd been annotating. We're pregnant, Sarah announced, her face glowing. That's wonderful, I said, embracing them both. Sophie would have been an amazing aunt. Actually, Griffin said, we've been talking about names. If it's a girl, we'd like to call her Sophie, but only if you think that would honor her memory properly. I felt tears prick my eyes. I think Sophie would be honored to have her name carry forward. And if it's a boy, Sarah added, we were thinking Raymond, after the grandfather who taught us that love sometimes requires patience. I couldn't speak for a moment. 3 years of careful distance had led to this, a family united not by blood alone, but by shared understanding of loss, healing, and the courage to honor difficult truths. Griffin, I said finally, would you play the piece one more time? I'd like Sophie to hear how beautifully you've learned her favorite music. As the gentle notes filled the room, I closed my eyes and remembered that night at Carnegie Hall. Sophie's radiant joy, Griffin's proud face in the audience, the impossible beauty of music bridging past and future. Sometimes the most powerful response really isn't the fastest one. Sometimes love works best when it's patient, when it waits for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. And sometimes the greatest gifts we can give are the ones that help others remember who they used to be. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Remember, the people in your life might be carrying more love for you than you'll ever know.